Capital punishment sentence of Brad Keith Sigman was carried out tonight pursuant to the order of the South Carolina Supreme Court and in accordance with state law. The execution was performed at 6:05:50.
Brad Sigman was sentenced to death for killing his ex-girlfriend's parents. His latest appeal denied.
He was the first man in modern South Carolina to face a firing squad. But before the bullets came decades of appeals, soul-searching, and the memory of a brutal double murder. This is the story of Brad Sigman, his crime, his final words, and the historic execution that reignited a national debate. In April 2001, Brad Sigman entered the Greenville, South Carolina home of David and Gladys Lark, the parents of his ex-girlfriend. Armed with a baseball bat, he bludgeoned both to death, fracturing their skulls in a gruesome rampage. As their daughter returned home, Sigman kidnapped her at gunpoint. She escaped, but the horror had already been sealed. 10 days later, Sigman was arrested, convicted in 2002, and sentenced to death.
Sigman, carrying a baseball bat, made his way into the home and found 62-year-old William David Larkey in the kitchen and beat him repeatedly with the bat.
Sigman's 2 decades on death row were marked by change. According to spiritual advisor Reverend Hillary Taylor, he became deeply religious, mentoring inmates and even sharing his commissary with others. In his final days, his lawyers appealed for clemency, citing his remorse and ministry behind bars. But the Supreme Court and Governor McMaster rejected all requests.
He was very afraid of lethal injection because 3 of his fellow death row inmates and friends had done lethal injection and had had terrible experiences, and he was very concerned about the pain.
Sigman's 2 decades on death row were marked by change. According to spiritual advisor Reverend Hillary Taylor, as the date drew near, public attention swelled. Protests formed outside Broad River Correctional Institution. It would be the first firing squad execution in the U.S. since 2010. Sigman chose this method, fearing the pain of botched, lethal injections or mutilation by the electric chair. On March 7, 2025, at 6:05:50 p.m., 3 riflemen fired from behind a wall 15 feet from Sigman, his body strapped to a metal chair, a target over his heart. His final words, read by his attorney, called on Christians to help abolish the death penalty. His last meal? Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Sigman's execution reignited debates over capital punishment in America. Activists condemned the method as barbaric. Randy Gardner, whose brother was the last U.S. inmate executed by firing squad in 2010, called it cruel and inhumane. For many, the question isn't just about how we execute, but why we still do.
It's very vicious and cruel and unusual punishment, and I don't think you should be executing anybody in any way.
Journalists and witnesses described a haunting scene. A black curtain lifted, revealing Sigman, hooded, motionless. Seconds later, shots rang out, simultaneous, loud, and final. A red stain appeared over his heart. The room remained silent. Death was declared at 6:08 p.m.
Brad Sigman took several pretty deep breaths, and then suddenly the shots rang out at, I believe Christy said it was 6:05 and 50 seconds. At that point, you did see a small red stain on Sigman.
Brad Sigman's life ended with 3 bullets, but his story echoes far beyond a prison wall. For some, it's justice served. For others, it's a barbaric relic of the past. Whether you see it as punishment or cruelty, one truth remains. Executions reflect not just on the condemned, but on the society that carries them out. He was the first man executed in Louisiana in over 15 years. But what really brought Jesse Hoffman to the death chamber wasn't just the crime. It was the battle over how he would die. Nitrogen gas, religious freedom, nearly 3 decades of appeals, and a family still grieving. This case isn't just about one man. It's about how we define justice. From a brutal murder in 1996 to courtroom battles in 2024 and a historic execution in 2025. This is the story of Jesse Hoffman, a case that tested the legal, moral, and constitutional limits of capital punishment.
Hoffman would be the state's first execution in over 15 years if it is to get underway. Hoffman was scheduled to be executed by the nitrogen hypoxia method. It would be the first of its kind here in Louisiana.
In November 1996, 18-year-old Hoffman kidnapped Molly Elliott at gunpoint in a parking garage in downtown New Orleans.
Molly was brutally and mercilessly raped and murdered. She was only 28 years old.
Thanksgiving Day, 1996. A young woman vanishes in New Orleans, and what happens next shocks the state. It wasn't just a murder, it was cold, calculated, and horrifying in detail. The type of crime that would ignite demands for the harshest punishment possible.
On November 28, 1996, on Thanksgiving Day, a duck hunter found Molly Elliott's naked, dead body abandoned on a makeshift dock where she had been shot in the head execution style.
For 26 years, Jesse Hoffman waited on death row, his sentence looming, yet always delayed. In those decades, laws changed, governors changed, and execution protocols changed. But Hoffman's sentence remained unchanged until a new method reignited the battle. While behind bars, Hoffman filed multiple appeals, challenged Louisiana's death penalty law, and eventually, in 2023, filed for clemency. In the weeks before his execution, his lawyers made one final push, claiming nitrogen gas would violate his Buddhist faith and subject him to cruel and unusual punishment. But time was running out.
Hypoxia, Hoffman and his lawyers say that the gassing method violates his rights to practice Buddhism through breathing meditation in the last moments of his life.
March 18th, 2025, after weeks of legal chaos and national headlines, Jesse Hoffman's execution was scheduled to proceed. Every motion had failed. Even the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. This would be Louisiana's first execution in 15 years, and the first using nitrogen gas. On the morning of his execution, Hoffman met with family, his attorneys, and a spiritual advisor. At 6:12 p.m., he was strapped to a gurney, a gas mask placed over his face. There was no final meal, no final words, just silence and nitrogen. For the state, it was about justice. For the family, closure. For many watching, it raised troubling. Hoffman declined a last statement. Nitrogen began to flow at 6:21 p.m. For 19 minutes, the room remained quiet until a flatline confirmed he was dead. Outside, protests echoed Buddhist chants. Inside, officials called the process flawless. And at 6:50 p.m., Jesse Hoffman was pronounced dead.
Mr. Hoffman declined a final meal. At approximately 6:12 p.m., Mr. Hoffman was escorted to the execution chamber.
But not everyone saw justice. Some saw injustice and cruelty in its purest form. The use of nitrogen gas raised alarms among religious leaders, legal scholars, and activists who questioned whether a line had been crossed. Outside the prison, protesters held vigils. Religious leaders decried the method. Advocacy groups vowed to fight for others still on death row. Louisiana had made history, but not without controversy.
While there may be legal methods to kill a human being, there is never a moral or an ethical way to kill a human. Gassing, while it may seem mundane, it is very excruciatingly painful.
What was it like inside the room? Reporters witnessed what no one had seen in Louisiana in over a decade. It wasn't painless. It wasn't peaceful. What witnesses saw sparked even more debate. Two reporters described twitching, convulsions, and Hoffman's chest rising. Officials claimed it was expected, but the visual of a man suffocating behind a mask left a mark. For many, it was a chilling look at the reality of death by gas.
I could see some blinking. His chest was moving up and
the arms, their arms are sort of like at this angle, and he was pulling up, sort of the whatever movement he was doing felt like he was pulling up.
Some called it justice, others called it torture. In a country deeply divided on the death penalty, Jesse Hoffman's execution by nitrogen gas didn't just end a man's life. It reignited a national debate. And for the family of Molly Elliott, one truth remains. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, but it is always justice felt. It was a crime that haunted a Florida community for over 3 decades. The brutal murder of an 8-year-old girl and her grandmother inside their own home. Now, the man responsible has been executed. But what led to this final act of justice?
He also sexually assaulted and killing her grandmother, 58-year-old Betty Dick, in Castleberry in September of 1990.
Year-old girl and her grandmother. Edward James was drunk and used drugs in the...
On March 20th, 2025, Edward Thomas James was executed by lethal injection after spending nearly 3 decades on death row. The night of September 19th, 1993 started like any other. But before it ended, 2 lives were stolen in one of the most horrific acts Seminole County had ever seen. Under the influence of drugs and alcohol, Edward James turned on the very family that had taken him in. His crimes would not only claim lives, but devastate generations. At some point, Eddie returned to the living room and grabbed 8-year-old Toni Neuner by the neck, pressing so hard that he could hear the bones in her neck crack. Thinking she was already dead, he carried her to his room, removed her clothes, and sexually assaulted her. Edward James was sentenced to death in 1995. Over the next 30 years, he would file appeal after appeal, all denied. His lawyers argued mental decline, drug-induced psychosis, even violations of the 8th Amendment. But nothing stopped the clock. By March 2025, the final hour had arrived. Appeals were denied by the U.S. Supreme Court. The state had prepared. The date was set. And justice, as many believed, was finally ready to be served. March 20th, 2025. Edward James spent his final day alone. No visitors, no final words. His final meal remains undisclosed. At 8:15 p.m., he was pronounced dead. For the family of the victims, it was the end of a nightmare that had lasted 31 years.
Edward James had no visitors on the last day of his life, and he gave no final statement. His time of death was 8:15 tonight.
As always, not everyone agreed. Protesters gathered outside the prison with signs that read, "Execution is not the solution." Meanwhile, supporters of the death penalty called it overdue justice for an unforgivable crime.
Some holding signs that said things like, "Execution is not the solution."
I wouldn't want for somebody else's son what I wouldn't want for my own. And every execution creates new victims.
Outside the prison, family members of the victims waited. For decades, They carried the weight of the trauma. Finally, they watched the man who shattered their lives draw his last breath. Closure didn't bring joy, but it brought peace.
We wish you guys can understand the pain that he's caused, and we thank you for everything.
Edward James died as he lived,
1993,
alone
Nooner was
and
just
broken.
8 years old.
But the
Now,
lives
James
he
was on the
stole
run for a period
can
of time,
never
and
be
the case
restored.
was featured on
For
America's
Tony and
Most
Betty,
Wanted, which
and for
detectives
their
credited
family who
with
lived in grief for over 30 years, justice finally came. Not with vengeance, but with finality. In a quiet Oklahoma town, a horrifying home invasion would forever scar a family and ignite a legal journey lasting 2 decades. Wendell Grissom, once a drifter, became a death row inmate after a senseless and brutal act. Now, after 20 years, the justice system has spoken. But was it truly justice, or just the end of a long nightmare?
It was a horrifying home invasion, a gunman picking a home at random and opening fire, killing a woman.
It was a random choice with devastating consequences. On November 3rd, 2005, Wendell Grissom, high on vodka and armed with 2 guns, invaded Drew Cupp's home in Blaine County. Inside were her 2 daughters, a toddler and a newborn, and her best friend, 23-year-old Amber Matthews. Amber was holding the infant when Grissom opened fire. She was shot twice in the head, dying while shielding the baby. Drew was shot multiple times but survived. In that moment, an ordinary day became a battleground and a tragedy that demanded justice.
Wendell Grissom, who murdered 23-year-old Amber Matthews while she was holding her friend's baby.
Grissom spent nearly 20 years behind bars, awaiting death. During that time, he claimed remorse, embraced religion, and told reporters he had changed. His legal team filed for clemency, arguing that his childhood trauma, brain damage, and intoxicated state warranted mercy. But for the families left grieving, it wasn't enough. Forgiveness was one thing. Accountability was another.
Convicted of killing a woman back in 2005, Wendell Grissom shot and killed 23-year-old Amber Dawn Matthews during a home invasion in Blaine County. Prosecutors say Grissom...
As March 20th, 2025 approached, tension built. For the survivors, it was a moment they thought might never come. For Drew and her daughters, it wasn't just about closure, it was about reclaiming peace. 20 years in the making.
Just after 10 a.m. this morning for the 2005 murder of Amber Matthews. Now, the story is that Grissom picked up a hitchhiker and the 2 decided to rob homes. They randomly invaded Drew Cupp's house where Matthews was visiting her 2 daughters.
Public reaction was mixed. Some saw justice served. Others questioned whether Grissom's remorse and time served should have earned clemency. Yet amid the debates, one truth stood clear. Amber Matthews was remembered not as a victim, but as a hero. Her legacy etched into the lives she saved.
That Amber Matthews doesn't cross her family's mind.
Selfless. I mean, anybody that knows her story, knows this story, sees that she was selfless.
In the mind.
Inside the death chamber, Drew Cupp and her now grown daughters watched as the man who had changed their lives forever took his final breath. He looked like just an ordinary old man, they said, but his words left a mark. Forgive me, not for me, but for you. A strange mix of closure and pain filled the room, proof that even justice doesn't erase the past.
He just looked like, a normal guy.
Looked like an average old man.
Yeah.
He said, I want you guys to forgive me, not for me, but forgive me for you guys so you can move on. That gave me a peace of mind and some healing.
Justice is rarely simple. For Drew, Riley, and Gracie, survival came with scars that never fully healed. For Amber Matthews, her final act was one of unimaginable courage. And for Wendell Grissom, redemption came too late. In the end, it wasn't just a case about crime and punishment. It was about memory, legacy, and the strength of those left behind.